Hi, everyone. I am Michelle Geida, and I am pleased to be joined by Fred Kempe. He is President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. Before that, Fred was a prize-winning editor and reporter at the Wall Street Journal for more than 25 years, including being the longest-serving editor and associate publisher ever of the Wall Street Journal Europe. So we'll talk with Fred today about the future of transatlantic relations and what's next for U.S. foreign policy. So thanks, Fred, for joining me today.
My pleasure.
All right, let's start with the future of transatlantic relations. Ambassadors from the 27 EU countries convened on November 30th. They discussed an agenda to help renew and reinvigorate cooperation and collaboration between the United States and Europe. They focused on 5 key policy areas, things like health, including fighting the COVID-19 pandemic, boosting economic recovery, combating climate change, promoting peace and security, and upholding shared values, including a belief in multilateral rules. Should we, in fact, expect big changes in these areas under a Biden administration? In your opinion, what changes and what remains difficult between the United States and Europe?
Yeah, Michelle, thanks for starting there, because I think the initiative from the European Union and from the Commission is a really interesting one, because they haven't had a smooth relationship with the Trump administration, particularly not the European Union. And so they've been, obviously you don't turn this around in just the days after the election. They've been working on this agenda for some time. And they wanted to come out of the box first, knowing that the Biden administration is likely to be receptive for this sort of initiative. The Biden administration wants to come out of the box fast. I think you're going to see a first 100 days where they really try to get quite a bit done. I've talked to people in the Biden team, and they're setting as a priority, obviously, building back better at home post-COVID and through economic stimulus. They see the strength of the American economy and the United States itself as the precondition for engaging with the world. And that's very much as the Trump administration saw it as well. The second step, however, for them is really reaching out to, with one Biden official said, getting the band back together. So working very closely, particularly with Democratic partners and allies, to see what they can do in terms of common cause. We'll have to see in the next year whether they can turn this into concrete outcomes, or whether it becomes, or whether it's just lovely rhetoric. But I think there's going to be a lot of effort to get concrete outcomes early on, to put points on the board. Their regional priorities, as relayed to me again by Biden-elect administration officials or people who are likely to go into the administration. Regional priority number 1, Indo-Pacific, but regional priority 2 is the transatlantic space, so Europe. So the one region, because it's the region of the future, but they believe that to deal with China, you don't have as much leverage if you're dealing with 20 to 25% of global GDP with China. But if you can get allies, Asian and European, together, then you've got 60% of GDP. And if you bring rules to the table, it's more likely that China will have to play by them if they come together. So I would watch particularly in that area. And you'll just see much more engagement in an active engagement within multilateral institutions, G7, G20. The UK is going to be chairing the G7 in 2021. The UK wants to work very closely with the Biden administration to set up a G7 agenda. And they're also hosting the COP Climate Summit. And you're going to see the Biden administration pushing climate issues right to the top of their agenda. And that's going to be quite popular with European partners.
You talked about the 2 priorities of the Biden administration, the Indo-Pacific and then the transatlantic relationship. Can we talk about the role of NATO within the context of both of those? Yeah. The Atlantic Council recently published a series of essays, 20 bold ideas for the future of NATO after the 2020 election. Things like expanding to include Japan, Australia, Mexico, India, or things like a digital Marshall Plan to secure 5G national networks. What is the role of NATO when it comes to navigating both of these foreign policy priorities in the Indo-Pacific and in Europe?
So on NATO, the one thing that I think was very healthy that came out of the Trump administration was this pressure on Europe carrying more of its own burden. And there was much more of a conversation within Europe about European sovereignty, about strategic autonomy. The sovereignty discussion appeals to me because it's sort of, what does Europe need to be responsible for, and what does a sovereign Europe look like? The autonomy issue, I'm not sure any of us are autonomous in the world any longer, and I don't think the Central and East Europeans want to be autonomous, nor do the North Europeans want to be strategically autonomous from the United States. They like, and this gets to your NATO point, they like the NATO umbrella and security guarantee. I think where you're going to see change, and you're already seeing this from NATO now during the Trump administration, is Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg talked about NATO going, and he's actually doing a reflection right now for NATO to go in a more political direction and a more global direction. That doesn't necessarily mean global members, but it does mean global partners, and it does mean NATO itself will focus on what the security challenge of the time is, which is China. Political means, yes, we're still going to be a military organization, but we really have to also create political unity. And if you look at the bylaws of NATO, it really calls for that. It's been blocked in the past by primarily the French, but sometimes others as well. But it appears as though the Secretary General of NATO has the green light to take that forward. He's going to get a big embrace of this idea from the Biden administration. I think you'll see an early NATO summit of NATO leaders with an early trip to Europe, COVID-19 permitting. And I think you'll get a relatively early reach out to NATO. The other part of this is the Biden administration has called for a summit of democracies in the first year of the administration. It's unclear how many democracies. Some people are looking at the D10 format, which is the 10 leading democracies in the world. That's going to be a lot easier than trying to determine which democracies to invite and which not to invite. And if you end up inviting all of them, you're not going to get much of a discussion. So these are places to watch, but I think NATO is a good place to begin. And I think making it a more political organization and a more global organization.
Let's bring it back to two of the key issues that have been at the center of U.S. and European relations as well. One of those is technology and big tech. The other is trade. So let's start with tech. It's increasingly becoming obvious as an area for necessary cooperation between democracies in order to protect an open, democratic, and liberal world order, and to make sure that emerging technologies and future technologies are doing so. But if you look at the U.S. and Europe, it's a major sticking point, an area of tension when it comes to our relationship. Do you see this continuing, or can technology become an area of cooperation versus friction between the United States and Europe?
So there seems to be a olive branch in this outreach from the European Union to the Biden administration to discuss and perhaps have a better technological and digital relationship. As it stands now, the European Union has a great many initiatives going against the American tech giants, but you're also seeing some initiatives going in that direction in the U.S. Congress as well. We at the Atlantic Council have been very in favor of a transatlantic digital marketplace, a transatlantic digital space. So Europe doesn't have an Amazon, Europe doesn't have a Google, and you can't blame Amazon and Google for the fact that Europe hasn't taken these steps and innovative steps to create these giants. Now, at the same time, these companies have to play by European rules. But I would hope over time that the democracies of the world would get together and say, what we most of all want is an open and a free space in the internet. We most of all want to be leaders of a secure 5G. and that we really should work together on this. You can be pretty sure that China is not going to break up its technology giants. They will exercise more government control over them. We saw that recently in the fact that Jack Ma was unable to launch his Ant IPO, which would have been, I think, the largest IPO, if not in the world, certainly in China, but it might have been the largest the world had ever seen. And the government stood in front of that. But that doesn't mean they're going to break it up. It just means that they are going to create national champions that don't have the kind of limits on them that we're putting on the West. So I think we really do have to think of competition in new ways. We don't want companies to be monopolistic, but on the other hand, we do want our most innovative companies to be able to operate in each other's spaces, Europe and the United States, in the most innovative manner possible for the good of all democratic countries. And so I think that this is going to be one of the first big tests of the Biden administration, is with everything we talk about improving relations with Europe, can we also avoid a food fight over not just technology, but also these increasing battles between Airbus and Boeing. And you can bet that within not too long, you're going to have jumbo jets and transatlantic aircraft from China that are competing in that field. And so let's not knock each other out of the box. Let's find a better way to work with each other and settle these problems so we can go forward in this new era of major power competition and era of competition between democracies and autocracies.
It feels like when it comes to trade, there's a lot of optimism right now on the part of Europe that this will all improve. Our trade relations between the United States and Europe are going to improve come 2021 and beyond. Do you think that is the case, or what needs to happen in order for things to improve?
The problem is that the Democratic Party has been traditionally and particularly recently not particularly pro-trade. So I think a lot of the expectations of what the Democratic Party or what the Biden administration could bring the world on trade there may just be excessive hope in terms of our European and Asian partners. I think what you'll get is fewer skirmishes and one-off tariff skirmishes. I think that's right. Whether we'll actually be able to negotiate agreements that will compete with this 30-country agreement, I think it's 30-country agreement that China just entered in, RCEP. It's not a very deep agreement. It's a pretty shallow agreement, but still, seeing China being the leader and bringing this kind of a trade agreement together, it's the traditional position the United States would have been in the past. I fear we're not going to get back to that because, unfortunately, there seems to be a bipartisan skepticism right now about trade agreements and what they do for the American people and American jobs. I think there will have to be an education process for the American people for the next agreement to come along. As I talk to people who are likely to serve in the Biden administration, where there is a lot of promises, green trade agreements. That's going to be a very popular thing in the Biden administration, and you may see work in that direction. I'm interested to see how that translates into real action.
Weber Shandwick and KRC Research, we recently did a poll in November and asked Americans about their thoughts on the role of business when it comes to their own national security. 44% of Americans said it was very important that the company that they work for acts in order to advance and protect their national security. How do you think about that, and what can business leaders be doing in order to help protect the national security of the United States?
Michelle, that's such an interesting finding. You almost need follow-up questions, which is what do you then expect of your company? Because obviously the way Google can contribute to national security is quite direct. Any high-tech company can be directly helpful to national security through cooperation with the Pentagon, through developing secure 5G communication, and for ensuring that some of our most important technological advantages and secrets aren't pilfered, aren't stolen. So you can see some direct impact of all of them. I would say medical companies, if you look at those that are developing the vaccines, they are contributing to our national security if the vaccine comes more quickly and if it can be well distributed and all of those things. So I think what my own interpretation of what your poll has shown is employees want their CEOs and their corporate leaders to be leaders outside of just the company. And so they also show confidence in them to be involved in national security. But obviously that's going to be a far different role, if depending on whether you're a consumer goods company or whether you're a defense technology company.
What's next? What are the emerging political risks for business when it comes to 2021 and beyond?
Well, I mean, that's the thing about the world we're in is you can't predict the risks. None of us predicted that we were going to have the worst pandemic in a century this year, but we've got it. So what do you have to do as a business? You have to build resilience into your systems. You have to build in resilience, not only so you can absorb shocks, but resilience is really about taking that shock and growing back better. The Atlantic Council has actually grown on its revenue line by 20–30% this year. We've added staff, but that's because we were resilient. We absorbed the shock of COVID-19. We went into the digital telework realm, but then we added new tools to get new audiences and do our job even better. And the companies have done that during this year have done best. So I would say hard to predict the risk that's going forward. It could be deglobalization. It could be another pandemic. It could be political conflict of one side or another. I think the main thing you have to do is build resilience into the system so that you're not trying to predict specific shocks, but you're making your whole system resilient to whatever shocks may come along. And then when that shock hits, you don't say, oh, good heavens, what do we do? You say, how do we use this moment to protect what we've got, but then to build back better?
Thanks, Fred. Lots to be determined as we look to 2021, a new foreign policy landscape, a new administration. So I appreciate you joining me and sharing your insights.
Michelle, it's a great pleasure to talk to you as always.